authored article on the effects of the war.
I would not claim to be an expert, though.
I think it's foundational for the subject, and people will be referring to this particular article for decades. You know, they will keep writing about the event, but they will follow the historiography, which basically you have started by your article. So Pierre defended his PhD in Cambridge in political science, and then he worked as a researcher at Cambridge for a while, and then moved to the University of East Anglia, which still has a booming program of climate studies, interdisciplinary climate studies. Pierre is a part of it. Pierre Bocquillon.
Okay, so that's great. So you should be able to hear me. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you, Alexander, for inviting me. It's not my first time in Vienna, but certainly my first time at CEU, and I'm really delighted. I know people at CEU. I've worked with people at CEU, but not I didn't have the opportunity to come in person. So it's great to be here. Yeah, so I'm at the University of East Anglia. I'm in the political science department, but affiliated to the Tyndall Center, you may have heard, which is the big interdisciplinary center that works on climate change in particular and in the environment more broadly. And there are also some political scientists in the environmental science department with whom I know I collaborate, Andy Jordan and others. Okay, so I work, a lot of my work is related to the European Union politics and comparative climate and energy politics in Europe. And today I want to talk about a kind of a starting project on the climate backlash. So so it's quite in progress and tentative, but sharing some thoughts and hoping to have a good discussion from today. So in terms of, something that has been interesting me and has been puzzling me, the current backlash that we're experiencing against climate policy, and that's affecting also the European level, as I want to show and talk about today. It's something that I'm also working with some colleagues on thinking about the climate backlash at another level, which is the level of infrastructures and the kind of the pushback against infrastructure and how that translates into political mobilization, especially through the vote. So I'm working with a survey experiment with other colleagues. I'm not going to talk about that, but that's because that's a different level. The backlash can happen around specific infrastructure, or it can happen at the whole political community area and at the policy level. And that's what I'm focusing more on this. So I'm currently thinking about this through and doing some work. I'm working on this in particular with my good colleague and longtime collaborator, Thomas Molby, who is at King's College, London. And with Thomas, we are actually we're having a fieldwork trip next month to conduct some interviews to go deeper in some of these aspects. Okay, so that's just a bit of context, general context. Now, what I want to discuss today, and hopefully everyone online can hear me okay, is the impact of this climate backlash on the European level, and something that is very much ongoing, emergent, and happening as we speak, so to say. So to contextualize that, let's go back to the adoption of the European Green Deal. That was the major project of Ursula von der Leyen when she, for her first mandate as president of the European Commission in 2019. So she was appointed in a context of politicization of climate change, but what some others have called, and I think it's quite appropriate, a form of enabling politicization, with this mobilization from society, with Friday for Future, Extinction Rebellion, protest, and so on, that was putting pressure on politicians to act on climate change. And so she seized the moment and made the Green Deal a big project in 2019. So the Green Deal was originally proposed in 2019 and then fleshed out in the following years, and has kept being fleshed out because it has become this this political object without clear boundaries. Everything that the Commission was doing that was related to the environment in some way was labeled Green Deal, right? And the Green Deal is about energy and climate change, but it was also about food. And I say was because it's not so much the case anymore. It was about greening agriculture and so on and so forth, circular economy. But I focus especially, what interests me particularly, what I know the best is energy and climate. So that's what I focus on. Okay, so in this context of enabling politicization, the Green Deal is proposed, and it's in a context also where the Greens have the wind in their sails, so to say, with a very good return at the European election for the Greens, and the Greens are a little bit the queen maker in this nomination for president of the Commission. She relies on the Green to have the support of the European Parliament in ratifying her appointment by the head of state and government. In that sense, the Green got like quite a bit of influence as well in shaping the agenda of the Commission. And the Green Deal became one of the major projects. So from that follows the adoption of the targets that many of us will have heard about, the net zero target by 2050 that the EU has adopted, that has been enshrined into law, into a climate law adopted in 2021. And in also more shorter term targets, the flagship target is the reduction by 55% of greenhouse gas emission. It's a net reduction. Okay, so that's kind of like the big target. That's the context of the Green Deal. Fast forward to 2023, 2024, so the end of the term of the first term of Ursula von der Leyen as president of the European Commission, and she has been nominated for a second one. But fast forward to that period, it's very different context. The Green Deal has been adopted. Many pieces of legislation have been proposed and indeed debated, amended, adopted by the co-legislator, the European Parliament and the Council of the EU. And the Commission is pushing for the wrapping up of all the legislations of the Green Deal to show that it's delivering on its promises. But the context here is very different. 2023, the war in Ukraine has already been ongoing for more than a year. There are a lot of concerns around cost of living, inflation is very high, concerns about energy security, energy supply, and also increasingly concerns and claims from business about the regulatory costs of all this green legislation. A very different context, with also mobilization from stakeholders and from groups in society against a number of aspects of the Green Deal. And so the most prominent of this mobilization is probably the one most of us have heard about, which is around the question of rules for farmers. The farmers were mobilized in a variety of countries, and when the farmers mobilize, they are visible and they often have influence. Okay, so the Green Deal is being wrapped up in a context which is of politicization this time, but not enabling politicization like in 2019 when it was adopted, but in a context of constraining politicization here. There is politicization of the Green Deal. The issue is more salient, involving more actors, okay, prominent in the media, and yet with constraints. So that leads to the broader question I ask is about the implementation and future of the Green Deal, okay? What does it mean, this constraining politicization, this rise of climate populism and its political influence for the continuation of the Green Deal, its implementation, and also for future ambitions? These are two aspects that we can look at. So, and more broadly, the idea is to assess how the backlash plays out and how it influences policies and policy directions. Okay, in terms of directions, in terms of its scope, but also how does that play out? Okay, so before I delve into that in more details, I wanted to have a bit of a bird-eye view of the Green Deal and how the Green Deal has lived through crises. because this backlash around 2023, 2024, and which is still ongoing, is not the first crisis that the Green Deal is going through. The Green Deal was adopted just before COVID, but had to be developed in the context of the COVID crisis, which is an unprecedented large-scale crisis. It was developed throughout the war in Ukraine, concerns about energy supplies, rising prices, and so on. So a lot of a crisis, a lot of bumps along the road. 2023, 2024 is not the only crisis. So what the research, the work, and observation of this period suggests is that it has been remarkably resilient. When you look at the Green Deal, eventually most of the legislation adopted around energy and climate was adopted, despite COVID, despite the war in Ukraine, despite the rising prices. It hasn't been, the Green Deal hasn't unfolded, it hasn't been put on the back burner. It has even been used skillfully by political entrepreneurs as an opportunity to further develop climate policy. So you can see that in particular with the adoption of the big package, the next generation EU package with the recovery and resilience facility within it, which disburse money to support countries to respond to the crisis. And so the RRF, recovery and resilience facility, includes a key condition, which is the spending of 37% on climate projects. Okay, so here the COVID package is used to reinforce and support the objectives of the Green Deal. With the war in Ukraine, one of the response is the adoption of the REPower EU, and the REPower EU it adds some money in order to respond to the energy crisis. So and REPower plans can be added to the plans that are adopted as part of the RRF. Okay, so that's more ambiguous because it's more money again for energy, but here more for energy than for climate, and with the possibility to include fossil fuel infrastructures. So here the effect is much more ambitious. But climate here, the Green Deal is reframed successfully as an opportunity in the context of the war in Ukraine, an opportunity to plow in and move faster forward with renewables, with energy efficiency. What you see is not a decrease in the ambition, but in fact an increase in the ambition, with legislation as adopted following a special procedure to increase the targets for renewable energy efficiency, which were adopted as part of the Green Deal. So increase the target of renewable energy to 45%, increase the one for energy efficiency as well. So here, this crisis suggests more policy expansion rather than policy dismantling, which is what you often would intuitively expect in the context of crisis, with new files introduced and new initiatives that are added. Okay, so where is the Green Deal at the end of the mandate of the Commission? What you see is that most of the files related to energy and climate change have been adopted. So the core of the energy and climate dimension of the Green Deal, that's the so-called Fit for 55 package, which aims to deliver the reduction of emissions by 55%. And when the Fit for 55 package was originally 13 and then 17 and then 19 legislative proposals. Out of all these proposals, all have been eventually adopted by the end of the term of the Commission. So in that sense, here the EU and the Commission have delivered. Only one file was not adopted, and that was the file on energy taxation. But here, that's not really too much of a surprise or a disappointment, if you ask me, because energy taxation is something that is particularly sensitive, that is decided by unanimity. So it's very difficult for all the member states to be all on board with that. So energy taxation, there have been several attempts at revising it that have failed. So it's yet another tentative that failed here. But overall, quite successful for most of the legislation, including the reform of the emission trading scheme, reform the new version of the non-ETS target, the so-called effort sharing, revision of the Renewable Energy Directive with an enhanced target, as I said, and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to go through it. Most of it is update of past legislation, but there are also some new legislation, some of it quite innovative that's also adopted, in particular the so-called CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is a carbon tax at the EU border that is being in the process of being implemented right now. Also an emission trading scheme specific to housing and transport, two particularly difficult sector, a just transition fund, and a new, and I mention it because I'll mention it again, new rules for deforestation. Okay, so when you look at the Green Deal, when it comes to energy and climate, overall, no policy dismantling here, but rather policy expansion, and quite successful at adopting it. When you look at the other parts of the Green Deal, which I look less at, you can see already a lot more contestation and a backlash happening. That's the case with the watering down of the nature restoration law that mandates 20% of restoration of habitat, watering down of the pesticide and other agricultural file. So here you see a difference between energy and climate that are still seen as kind of like core to the project of the Commission versus the much more contested and also linked to agriculture. So in that sense, much more contested by the powerful farming lobby. Okay, so relative success, but the Green Deal is fine. It's fine. All these fines have been adopted. When files, if they are not implemented effectively, might not be very useful. And now we are only entering in the phase of implementation of the Green Deal, and that's where things get complicated. And where we can expect, and something I want to mention later, also contestations through the back door in implementation, the post-adoption politics, which is often more neglected. We focus on when file and objectives are adopted, we focus a lot less as political scientists and also as citizens on what happens afterwards. But a lot of this implementation is likely to be contested in the new context. So now let me take just a step back to try to think a little bit about the present and future of the Green Deal in this context of backlash. Let's look a little bit at the literature on past crises in relation to the environment to see what they can tell us. And I'm here focusing on the EU literature on crisis and environmental policy. So work by Skovgaard, Charlotte Burns and Paul Tobin, Vivian Greve and Andrew Jordan and others. What they find, so a lot of this work has focused on the crisis that followed the economic and financial crisis, okay, and how EU environmental policies have responded to that. And what they find, what this literature suggests, is that there is a lot of what you can expect in a crisis: more division and resistance, tensions over resources in a context where resources are constrained, but that the crisis can also be used as by political entrepreneurs as window of opportunities in order to push measures framed as response. So it can be used also as an opportunity. The effect of the crisis tend to be differentiated. So when you look at ambitions, future ambitions, what you see is a lot of dampening. That's a lot of what happened following in the 2010 during the Eurozone crisis. A lot of low ambition in terms of environment more generally, energy and climate change in particular, with targets, for instance, that are less ambitious in their trajectory and so on. And also less entrepreneurship from actors to push ambitions. But the literature finds also a lot of institutional stickiness, okay? Especially, and that's the case in general for the environment, but that's especially the case for climate change. Climate change is the well-entrenched policy with a lot of policies that have a long history, that are strongly institutionalized. And so it's kind of hard to go back. There is a lot of institutional stickiness. And what the literature finds, especially the work by Paul Tobin or Charlotte Burns, is that a lot of the contestation is not about dismantling of files, dismantlings of laws and rules and regulation, but more through the watering down in implementation, through delegated acts, reviews, through the various deadlines for implementation. You find basically much like contestation happening and sometimes undermining the implementation. So a lot of backdoor contestation. Okay. So overall, the story of the literature, as I would summarize, is one of resilience, overall resilience. Okay, maybe less ambition, but resilience of the policy framework. So, what about this time? Is it different this time? So this time, we have the European climate policy is facing a triple challenge. On the one hand, you have domestically the rise and influence of far right and populist right populist actors, which increasingly make climate change and the Green Deal a wedge issue. Okay, a wedge issue to try to divide coalitions. And they can be successful on their own by getting large groups in parliament, for instance, by getting in coalition governments in a number of countries. But they also have, their influence also goes through the mainstream right-wing parties. Okay, so that's what you see is their influence, that mainstream right-wing parties tend to kind of follow them and then become more and more less and less ambitious on climate change. So that's the kind of like a domestic challenge that also links to the external challenge that the EU is facing that are particularly relevant. So the war in Ukraine has diverted economic and financial resources. It has also diverted attention from climate change. And it has raised to the fore questions around the security of energy supply. And increasingly geoeconomic competition with the US and China is quite prominent, with the fear of loss of competitiveness vis-a-vis these two giants, and now the trade wars of Trump. Okay, so this is the context that in which this backlash is happening. Now, I want to kind of try to unpack this backlash. So first, just a couple of some conceptual clarification about the backlash. So what is the backlash? The first thing is that contestation is inherent to politics. Okay, so you would expect contestation in any case. But when we talk about a backlash, and here I borrow the definition of Patterson, that's also built on Alter and Zone. The backlash is particularly abrupt, forceful, negative reaction to a certain types of policy in order to return to the ex-ante status quo. And so with a mobilization of actors using, including through the use of extraordinary means. So there is this idea with the backlash that it's not just like normal contestation through the institutionalized channels, but that it also uses extraordinary means beyond established procedures. Okay, so backlash that can involve the public, that can involve interest groups, that can involve elites, including party elites. Okay. The backlash can, with the idea of backlash, there is this idea that it's a backlash against policy. So one of the sources of the backlash may be the effect of the policies. And as EU policies have become more stringent over time, they are producing more effect. They are becoming harder. They are producing more effect on citizens, on various stakeholders, so they are more likely to react. So the backlash can be triggered internally by the policies themselves, creating a form of negative feedback. But what you find is that wider factors matter as much, and I would argue, in the case of the EU, matter even more. Okay, wider factor, wider contestation of related issues, the role of actors in kind of framing climate change as linked to these all other contested issues. Material concerns might be a driver. Indeed, the impact of policies, for instance, the impact on the cost of fuel, the impact on the use of combustion car, the impact on renovation of buildings and so on, that affects people. They might react. The material interests, material concerns do matter. And there are a number of studies by various academics that show the importance of this kind of like that the people affected can react because it affects their material concerns. But a lot of the literature related to the backlash or to climate populism tends to argue that what matters as much is the perception, the framing, that it's not just all about material concern, and that sometimes the people who are the most mobilized might not be directly the most impacted, that the framing matter very much. And I think that's something we see to a large extent in the EU. So it can be driven by economic concerns, but also by these wider ideological, cultural factors. So for instance, Matthew Lockwood, who has written Climate Populism, insists a lot on that and actually takes the side of saying it's actually these ideological factors that matter most. It's because climate populists don't like climate policies because they don't like cosmopolitan worldviews, because they don't like elites, including experts and scientists. And that's what's driving more climate populism than actually hard material concerns. He's not saying that they don't matter, but he kind of like take this side that the structural factor might be mattering less than the ideological one in the case of populism. And in terms of the effect of the backlash, the effect can be on existing policy in implementation. It can be on also forward ambition, or more generally the legitimacy of specific actors, or the legitimacy of the policy or the policy area. Okay, so now let's delve into this contestation, this backlash against climate policy. So it's something in 2023, 2024, a lot of this was reported in the news. It became a buzzword in the media, if you look around that time. So green backlash, green lash, environmental backlash, climate backlash. You find a lot of reporting around that. That was triggered in large part by the mobilization, in particular, of farmers all across Europe, from France to Belgium to Romania to Poland, okay, where you had farmers taking the streets against the regulatory burden of environmental policy, including also climate policy. But under this umbrella of a backlash, so the most visible, the most easily identifiable was perhaps the mobilization of farmers, and it was quite striking because this farmer mobilization, they regularly happen in one country or another in the EU, or indeed in Brussels, where you regularly have farmers on the main roundabout around the Commission. So that happens quite often. But what was particularly striking here was the fact that it was transnational in various different countries, north, south, east, and west. But what you see is also mobilization around a number of other issues, not just farming, including climate change. So I've kind of just put here some examples of such kind of like mobilization. So for instance, mobilization around the clean eating law in Germany that almost broke the coalition at the time, okay, which was encouraging the shift from gas boiler towards renewable heating and heat pumps. Mobilization around nitrogen pollution in the Netherlands. And in terms of like, especially to focus on climate related, you had mobilization. You had mobilization in a number of countries around carbon tax, around clean eating. That were the most contentious issues. Against phase out of combustion cars, which is linked to the regulation on car emission in the EU. So what's striking here? So part of this effect of the backlash is linked to kind of like the media attention. Suddenly we started talking about mobilization related to climate change in terms of backlash, and then suddenly it feels like the backlash is everywhere. Okay, so part of it has to do with this media effect, and we should be careful about that. But not all of it it's also linked to the fact that climate policy has started to bite more, and that in a context that is more difficult, people feel it more. And that means that for political entrepreneurs, especially on the right of the political spectrum, they have a space to politicize the issue. So, okay, so some examples here, and I could provide more, but that's not the point. So what were the concerns? The concerns were driven by cost of living and competitiveness aspects. Okay. Does that mean that everyone was worried about the cost of climate policy suddenly? Not quite, because when you look at opinion survey, you find still quite a lot of support. So you find, if you look at the Eurobarometers, you find quite high support for climate policy, even throughout the cost of living crisis. You have some other studies, such as one by Tariq Abu-Shadi, for instance, who show that people actually are relatively supportive of climate change, climate policies, provided that those most impacted are compensated in some ways. Okay, so overall, like, there's still quite strong support for climate policy, but strong mobilization against it from impacted stakeholders or right-wing populist entrepreneurs against it. Of course, these surveys also need to be taken with caution. When you ask people in general if they want more climate policy than the EU to do more about it, or if they tend to support it in general, but they might be much more skeptical when it comes to more specific policies and then their direct impact. Okay, so a lot of the claims have been made around the cost of green policies and regulatory burden, and that's something that has become quite central in the discourse against European climate policy, that they add regulatory burden. And that's something, this discourse has permeated the discourse even within institutions, where now regulatory burden is something that is quite prominent in the new initiatives of the Commission. This politicization has been very much driven by the populist and far right, but what you see is that it has permeated to the center right. And at the European level, that's very clear, for instance, when I'll show that in a minute, when you look at the European Parliament, you see increasingly the European People's Party, the grouping of center right parties, aligning much closer with the far right groups, being ready even to vote against certain legislation or to water down certain legislation along with the far right. A lot of the mobilization has been around agriculture, but it's not just about agriculture. It also affects climate. Okay, so what I'm interested in is how that feeds into how this mobilization, this backlash feeds into the policy-making process and affect policies. So you have affected stakeholders who will, of course, lobby at the national level or at the EU level against certain policies. But this is very much steered by political elites, and especially, to say quickly here, populist parties, which not only kind of seize on the issue, but also shape the discourse around these issues to try to influence especially governments. And that then feeds into climate policy. So part of the backlash might be coming from the impacts of policies on stakeholders. But here, I think I would argue that this link here is quite weak at the European level. A lot of the claims that have been made against European policy at national level, they were often very loosely connected to any EU policies, or sometimes they were, but not extremely clearly. Okay. So I would say that's more, and a lot of the policies of the Green Deal, they only start to bite progressively. Many of the policies have basically phased implementation and so on, which means that they start biting progressively, but they haven't started biting even before they have been implemented. So a lot of kind of the contestation of Green Deal policies is, in fact, I would argue, driven from that side of the schematic representation of the process. So all these kind of linkages is something that I, with Thomas, want to kind of go deeper into. So we haven't fully done that. And so I'm just presenting just some preliminary thought around that now. Checking the time. Okay. Okay, so in terms of contestation and backlash feeding. Oh. Yeah. Okay. In terms of contestation and backlash feeding into the European level via government. So what you see is that a number of governments have made important pronouncements saying, okay, we need to slow down on the Green Deal. And indeed, the Green Deal itself has become a bit toxic as a motto and has been reframed as a Green Industrial Deal by the Commission as a result. Now, there is much less talk of a Green Deal and much more focus on the industrial aspect and competitiveness. Okay, and some governments, prominently the French government, but also the Belgian government and others, have said, okay, perhaps we are going too far in reaction to the mobilization. Perhaps we are going too fast with all this climate and environmental policy. So Macron made a big statement back in 2024, that was 2020, end of 2023, which was kind of like a bit of a shock when he said, okay, we're just going too fast. And then other leaders have done the same. And so just to illustrate, we have now the European Council. So the European Council at the head of state and government when they meet in the European setting. And the head of state and government now, they change all the time depending on the domestic politics. But just like a snapshot shows that, so that's on the left here, you can see the composition of the European Council last summer in June 2024, at the time of the election, is much more leaning towards the right, okay? With others being, some of them are also kind of like more populist far right. Okay, so we have heads of state and government, we have governments that are increasingly worried, a number of them, and not just the usual suspects. When you talk about climate policy, you would always have Poland being leading the contestation. You often find Hungary as well. So these usual suspects. But now what you see is the shift with other governments that were much more supportive, that are becoming less supportive. So I use that, the European Council, as an example. It feeds also, of course, at the level of the ministers when they discuss the nitty-gritty of legislation, which is not done at this level. But it's to illustrate the broader point. In terms, it doesn't affect just government. It has affected also the Commission. The composition of the Commission, the College of Commissioners, so the political level of the Commission, has also shifted right. So that's the difference between the Commission in 2019, when the Green Deal was adopted, versus the Commission now. I think you can see quite clearly the shift within the Commission. And that has translated into the debate around implementation of the Green Deal, about the Green Industrial Deal, about the new proposals that are being put forward, or the revision of existing proposals. And you see some harsh debates and tensions emerging within the Commission as well. So the Commission is also not anymore this kind of entrepreneur necessarily driving the climate agenda, but much more cautious, in part because it's responding to governments, in part because if you want to implement legislation, you need governments on board, in part because when you want new legislation, you need also a majority of government. So the Commission adapts to the strategic environment, but also because within itself, there have been a shift. And you have a prominent socialist and Democrat who is in charge of the Green Industrial Deal, Teresa Ribera, but she's surrounded by other commissioners who are not from a political leaning. And that has led to a number of conflict and divergences on the way forward. So that can impact the ambition of going forward. And then when you look at the other key institution, and that's even easier, you look at the European Parliament, and you can see here the importance of the shift in the majority of the directly elected representative of Europeans. The big winners of the last European election, this time that's not the Green. The Greens are actually the big loser. They lost a very large number of the members of the European Parliament, from around 70 to 50 now. So they are the big losers, when the big winners are the EPP and the variety of far-right or populist group. Okay, so the political spectrum has also shifted in the European Parliament. And that impacts policy. One such example that's probably has been talked about the most has been around the deforestation, the legislation to prevent imported deforestation. And here you saw, what you have seen is that the EPP was ready to ally with far-right groups to try to water down this piece of legislation. It was indeed watered down. And that was a bit of a shock to many, that the EPP was ready to work. And you see the EPP, so the group of the center political party, becoming increasingly, I would say, radicalized on issues around climate. For instance, there was a memo that was leaked where they had listed a number of policy initiatives that they were trying to take down or to water down. Okay, so it was said, okay, well, it's just a memo, it's not an official document, and so on. But you can see the EPP has really hardened its position and become much more of an opponent of ambitious climate and energy commitment. Led by Manfred Weber, was had quite a bit of influence. He was an internal political opponent to Ursula von der Leyen, and now he's kind of wedging a lot of influence on the Commission. Okay, so how does this translate into policy impact? So what do we see emerging? So when you try to kind of track what's going on, I think to sum up, I would say that the headline targets and the overall governance architecture of the Green Deal and of energy and climate policies haven't been shaken yet. Okay, they have remained, and I would argue that there is very strong stickiness of these institutions that are well entrenched. Okay, so you find still the main pieces of legislation are not being fundamentally challenged. They will endure, but the devil is in the detail. The devil is in the details of implementation, especially in a context where there is a strong deregulatory drive in the name of competitiveness. For instance, the Draghi report was arguing for new investment, a number of things, including related to green policies, but was also talking about reducing the burden of too much regulation. And the way the Draghi report has been used has been very much in this sense of deregulation. What you see that the Commission now has proposed the competitiveness compact. When you look at the competitiveness compact that was proposed by the Commission in January, it talks very little about climate, but it talks a lot about energy. Okay, a lot about Indian energy, but framed in a much more kind of industrial and cost way. And the Commission has indeed even proposed a legislative effort that's called the Omnibus in February that aims to kind of try to reduce regulation complexity to make the EU more competitive, as well as a green industrial deals, which is a bit it's hard to see what it really entails at this point. Okay, so that's in terms of like at the broad level of framing and strategy. At the more nitty-gritty level, you have a number of examples of policy dismantling through the back door in implementation or through revision that are taking place. So one of the key example was the implementation of the law on imported deforestation. Okay, that's for a number of products, mandated the monitoring and forbid the importation of food products that were produced on deforested land. Okay, it was supposed to start being implemented from December 2025, but under the pressure of the center right allied with the far right, this was actually delayed by 1 year. Okay, so you could say, okay, it's just 1 year, so it's just taking a step back to move forward. Now the pressure from the same actors, and especially from the group of the European Conservative and Reformists, the group of Giorgia Meloni, is to try to delay further. Okay, and they are also trying to push for the EU to be considered a no deforestation zone, where this monitoring doesn't have to happen. So effectively, it's about try and try again. So that's one of these examples of policy dismantling through the back door, through delays. There are also examples of watering down provisions. So the omnibus that I mentioned on competitiveness basically revise a number of initiatives that are related to the Green Deal, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and also the Green Finance Taxonomy. And basically, through the calibration of the policy instruments, make them remove a lot of bites from these pieces of legislation. So here you can see an example of this kind of like policy dismantling on implementation. Another big recent example is around car emissions. So the car emission directive is quite controversial. The car emission directive sets reductions of set mandatory reductions of emissions for cars, to the point basically that it creates a ban on fossil fuel cars, combustion cars, by 2035. Okay, it's not written in the law like this, but the standard is so low that is effectively what it is. And that has been especially controversial. And now there is a big push to try to undermine the implementation of the car emission directives. So under the pressure of the car industry and a number of member states with strong interests, what you have seen is the proposal of an amendment that was adopted for calculating the emission reductions that the car manufacturers have to make for the cars they sell on an average of 3 years instead of the year of 2025, which was kind of the objective. So it's basically a way of making it easier for the European constructor to achieve the target. And that's something that was passed with large cross-party support in the European Parliament. So it's not just the far right and populist group. What's interesting, I think, with this case study, with this example, is the fact that the internal and the domestic interact a lot here. The argument was the cost, of course, the cost for the manufacturers, but also the question of competition with China. Okay, if we impose too much cost on our constructors, we won't be competitive with China, then we'll be just importing Chinese electric vehicles and so on. So here, the international context is used as an argument directly. So just to summarize, no direct assault on the headline target and the overall architecture, but pressure in implementation, especially on a number of files that have become kind of particularly politically contested and controversial. All right, so to finish, and so that we have enough time for the discussion, I try to think a little bit about mechanisms to assess the impact of the backlash on EU climate policy and ambition. I've tried to think a bit about mechanisms through which the politicization of climate change can negatively affect climate policy, and what are the mechanisms that may make policy still resilient. So so there are internal dimension and external dimension, and I try to break down each of them into. I struggle with this screen. Yeah, all right. Apologies for this. Should have used my good old clicker. Yeah. All right, I'm there. So in terms of kind of mechanisms of destabilization, okay, the current context means that green policies might represent costs for affected stakeholders. So they might have a direct interest in undermining ambitions in climate change. Focusing on institution, you could have policies that kind of drift, policies that are not updated, that become less relevant. In terms of ideas or discourse, the framing of climate change as inherently opposite to climate priorities. But on the other side, there are also mechanisms of resilience. So in terms of the interest, okay, there are affected stakeholders, but there are also public support and demand for climate and energy ambitions. In terms of institution, there is a lot of path dependency. Energy and climate policies are very well entrenched and are hard to take down. There is a vast body of legislation that's binding, that has been adopted, that is difficult to undo, and that has also legitimacy. Often the climate legislation now has often been adopted and then revised several times and has strong legitimacy. And in terms of ideas and framing, crisis and pressures can be presented as inimical to climate action, or they can be presented as climate policy. And then in terms of external dimension, here there is, in terms of the looking at interest, standards, green standards can be presented as costly in the context of international competitions. If we have high standards, that might put us at a disadvantage against our competitors, the US and China in particular. Or on the other hand, you could argue that green policies can be also an opportunity for green economic competitiveness, okay? Trying to take a lead or trying not to depend too heavily on China. Looking at institutions internationally, well, on the one hand, the EU is firmly committed to the Paris Agreement and needs to propose new ambitions, new ambitious targets in the context of the Conference of the Parties in Belém, which is where new commitments are expected. So there is pressure from international negotiation. On the other hand, international negotiations have been undermined by the dampening political climate, especially with the withdrawal of the US. Okay, so the pressure of international negotiation may not play as strongly as it has in the past. And in terms of framing internationally, here there are also two sides of this, in the sense of that green policies and climate policy can be framed in terms of burden and the need for deregulate and focus on other issues in the context of the war in Ukraine, or they can be presented as a way to show climate leadership. And the climate leadership discourse is one that is deeply entrenched in the European Union. Okay, it's one of climate change has become a flagship policy. So here you find these contradictory dynamics when you look at mechanisms that undermine climate ambitions and those that suggest resilience. So in terms of prospect, when I kind of like try to evaluate, I find like these contradictory dynamics at play at all levels, very much. So my kind of overall sense is that there is more resilience to be expected in terms of energy and climate than the discourse of the backlash would say in the European Union, because of some of the factors that I've outlined here. At the same time, resilience doesn't mean ambitions, okay? Especially in the context where the EU is moving to the new cycle of proposing further target beyond 2030 and the policies associated. Resilience doesn't mean new ambition. And the result could be something that resembles more stagnation or reframing, and it's perhaps what's happening, a reframing of climate and energy policy in a different way, focusing now more on competitiveness in industry, which means neglecting certain aspects, okay? And I think that's probably the most likely outcome to happen. All right, so that's kind of like my guess for the future to finish. And hopefully we have enough time for discussion and questions and so on. Thank you very much.
Yeah, time for discussion, please. comments and questions and objections and suggestions.
I don't know how we check online if anyone, you doing it?
I'll monitor it. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Maybe I should start. Thank you for your presentation. It's a nice one. Throughout the presentation, I was just thinking of, okay, climate backlash versus climate deny.
Mhm.
So which one leads to which? Because I was of this opinion that, okay, if we have climate backlash, either from political circle or from people outside the political circle, one way or the other is that shows that they are also denying the policy or denying the, I don't know, the occurrence of issue like climate change. Yeah, that's the aspect that is not quite clear to me. Because is it tending towards denying the climate change? Yeah.
Should I take questions as they come or points for discussions? I'm happy to do so. Yeah.
Right now,
All right. I don't know what the practice is, so that's why I'm asking. Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. I think so. There are a number of people that have argued, and I think rightfully so, that denialism nowadays might take the form of over denialism of climate change, saying it's not happening, we don't need to do anything about it, or it's exaggerated, or humans are not responsible for climate change. And that's kind of like the most overt classic denialism that you can think of. And it has receded, but not disappeared, as we see now. But that the new form of denialism is more the discourse of climate delay. That a lot of the denialism take the form of, okay, we don't need to act just right now, we have time, the market will solve it, we can do it later, and so on. And that's this discourse of climate delay has become the new form of denialism. And I would say that in the context, in the European context, where overt climatic skepticism and denialism doesn't exist in the same way as, for instance, say in the US or in some other countries, it's much more this form that it takes. A lot of the arguments of the populist right is around the cost of measures, around the timing of the response, and so on. And that's what they contest in the policies. They have tended to not, so far, what we have seen is that what you observe through a number of case studies, some that I've showed here and some others, is that they don't go for taking down the full policy, but just mostly undermining their effects by making them less and less effective. Yeah, that is so. It's a good question that they are directly linked to policy effect, I think.
So this just to add to this, that the extreme political events also distract attention from extreme weather events, like war, for instance. It's a kind of pretext for delay. Like, okay, climate change is important, but here we have a war in Europe. Therefore, we need to wait, or we have to wait until we resolve all these pertinent questions, and then do you observe this kind of effect that that politics works like a distraction from climate agenda?
Yes, that's definitely what you see is with war on top of the agenda. It has captured a lot of the political attention and distracted from climate change, and you can see it in the reporting around extreme climate events. They still happen, but when you have the immediate destruction of war in Ukraine, Gaza, and elsewhere, that seems like less prominent. So for sure, it has definitely shifted the attention from our missions.
Well,
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. So I have a very basic question about the lineage of the title of the policy, the Green Deal, and if it has any connection to the Green Deal in the US, which I think it was proposed earlier by AOC, sorry, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and the senator from New York, and the use of the word deal, which has obvious echoes from the US context. So was this a deliberate decision to suggest that there's a convergence of climate policy across the Atlantic, or what was the discussion, if there was any, in naming it this way? Right now, as is the case in many things, the Green New Deal is one of the cudgels of the right on Fox News against that. This is bad. This is not. This is the walkie liberals. Yada yada. Yeah. So, but what was the deliberation in naming the policy this way in the EU context?
Yeah, that's interesting. That links directly to the name of it. So it was very much a transatlantic policy discourse around the Green New Deal and so on that was going on, that the Commission picked upon. And that's so here clearly there is the kind of the US, the influence of the US left with this motto of the Green New Deal, because that's something that speaks directly to the political history of the US, which everyone knows about and so on. That's part of also of the imagination beyond the US, but it's very much originating from the US. And so von der Leyen was not particularly well known before being president of the Commission for being active on climate issues and so on. She had been ministers in Germany or various ministries, but not the Ministry of Environment. Lastly, in defense, was not particularly like a climate attuned politician. So when she picked, and she's a politician from the right. So when she picked it, she called it not the Green New Deal, but the Green Deal, with this idea that if you remove the new, it sounds a bit less like the deal from the left, and it's more like a deal from the right and the center. So here, like the change in the slight variation in the name, not Green New Deal, but Green Deal, was a way to kind of make it European, but also strip it a bit from its
alarming connotation.
Yeah, echoes of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others. Yeah. But that's kind of like, in some way there was a lot of transatlantic dialogue going on, because at the time you see a lot of circulation between, for instance, the climate movement in Europe and in the US, XR and Sunrise and so on and so forth. And then even at the political level, the rise of the net zero target as the kind of objective that everyone wants to adopt now. Everyone has adopted the net zero target, but that's all spread at that time. So there is this kind of circulation, and I think this political slogan of the Green Deal, Green New Deal is part of this kind of circulation.
It's not just a policy diffusion, but there's a bit of discursive diffusion. Sometimes, you know, it becomes nearly impossible to avoid a very good brand now that if you the Green New Deal or the Green Deal has come to capture a lot. You can say a lot by just using this title, and it made sense that it was not inevitable, of course, but it makes sense that the Europeans adopted.
Yeah.
I have, thank you very much for your presentation and the overview. Maybe I'm trying to think how to portray my question, honestly, because I think maybe it's beyond what you present. But I was curious on if these Green Deal policies and mechanisms are also included measures, legislations, mechanisms to control, manage European investments outside of European Union, or this kind of regulations outside of European Union, meaning the impact that activities of European entrepreneurs, companies, governments have outside of the European Union, and if this is included in this frame of this deal, and if this kind of policies have been touched by this whole far-righting, let's say, tendency on the deal. I don't know if my question is clear or if you have some idea about it, but I was just curious on precisely this flexibilization of, on the one hand, portraying European Union as this very green scenario and high-tech and cutting edge, but on cost of what? Which is this cost of what has been hidden a bit and flexibilized the impact or or the possibility of not to rule under the same legislations that rule under the countries here in the European Union, but outside, and kind of playing this double game that's very common, let's say.
Yeah, there's a very strong external dimension to the whole Green Deal agenda. You find it with the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, so the carbon tax at EU border. That's effectively taxing the carbon content of products being imported in the EU. So there is this strong external dimension that's quite obvious, and that has generated a lot of pushback from outside of the EU. With other countries being not happy with it, basically. And that's not just the US, but India and so on, many countries. And many countries like India, developing countries, they say what the EU is doing here is green protectionism. So they are definitely making this claim and taking them to the WTO, which doesn't work very much these days, but they are taking them to kind of contesting it in various arenas internationally. So there's a lot of pushback on that dimension. That's one example, carbon border adjustment mechanism. Another one is the legislation around deforestation. So that has kind of like strong implication for the regulation of agriculture in other countries. So that's again triggers opposition from countries which have strong agricultural interests and export to the European Union, Brazil and others. But also even internally, a lot of the kind of like companies and actors internally in the EU don't like this regulation. We find it's kind of a burden to have to prove that what they import is not coming from different deforested areas and so on. And that's why there was a lot of kind of pushback on this specific area. So that's an example. Then you have other examples such as the legislation that I mentioned towards the end. I'm just afraid to do that because I feel something bad will happen. No, it seems all right. This time I manage. Yeah, so for instance, so this legislation, corporate sustainability reporting, corporate due diligence reporting here, that's legislation that mandates, that force companies to report on the impact of their activities, green, but also in relation to social aspects in other countries. Okay, so, and they have been watered down because the interest within the EU are saying, oh, it's just too much burden for us to report and so on. So basically what they did, for instance, in the case of the CSRD, this one, is to increase the threshold to exclude SMEs, but by doing that, you exclude 80% of the companies that were covered by the directive before. So that's very significant, right? You change the threshold and that really completely changes the scope of the legislation. So that's something. So actually, these aspects of the Green Deal that have an external dimension have been particularly targeted actually by contestation, in fact. And often in the name of the impact it has on European investments and companies abroad and the fact that they are in competition with others and that they are going to lose in this competition if they are too regulated. So I think it's like, yeah, it's quite an important part of the external dimension. It plays an important part in the contestation.
So the European political system is huge, enormous network of institutions and laws, etc., and personalities. So it's trying to adjust and also to prevent the future catastrophe coming from nature, right? So this is kind of a unique, and Europe is leading in that. So it's a unique operation of huge kind of scale, which is happening in the present, but directed onto the future. And Europe has managed to consolidate somehow in the past, and fighting with all kind of risks and challenges and doubts and denials. Okay. But in the meantime, nature, so it's all about the kind of dialogue with nature. In the meantime, nature has its own say, its own, and potentially own impact on the process. There are floods. See, there was a flood here in Vienna a year ago. There was much more disastrous flood in Valencia. It happens in Europe, in Florence recently. Happens, we have statistics, happens more and more often, kind of more and more disastrous, less and less predictable. So all these events, they're like micro events that are parts of this huge process of climate change. still there were like 200 victims in Valencia. It's not so small, but it's of course very local. So what I missed in your presentation is kind of dialogue with nature. Like nature is doing its own thing, which is exactly a part of what we're talking about. It's kind of accelerating. It goes there, but it's going on right now. But the political system is kind of ignoring these challenges, and there are some kind of ways for that, like say localizing. That's a problem of Valencia. Say the mayor of Valencia made those mistakes. And I think we need to kind of look at it directly, like what are strategies of this kind of. It's not really denial, not really this. It's say the strategy of localization is just one of this type of response. There are others. So this political system in producing its response to this challenge for nature has developed its autonomy from this challenge, like ignoring it. And I think that needs to be questioned and criticized.
Yeah, I mean it's true. I see your point because the European Union is very much focused on mitigation rather than adaptation, reducing emission rather than responding to the impact of climate change. And often, in terms of response, the response is coming from at the national level or the local level. And there is kind of we saw that in Spain with this fight between whether the responsibility was the failure of the national level or the local level and so on, but with very little of the European Union in there. The response to emergency tends to be kind of like national competence done at the national level or at the local level, indeed, with the European Union playing very limited role or supportive role. There have been a bit of in terms at the level of discourse, what you see is that the European Union, at the European Union level, there is a bit of a realization of that and the effort to develop adaptation strategy and be more active on adaptation. Because for a long time, adaptation, that was, to say it very quickly, but adaptation, that was something for countries in the global south that were the most affected, they were more vulnerable and so on. So we need to send them aid to help them to respond to climate change, but then it's not really our problem. But now climate change is very much visible and has a lot of impacts, as you said, on European territories. And we see that every winter, every summer, and so on. And so there is this realization that there is more to be done collectively at the European level, and that there is a need for more focus on adaptation. But I think that's still the unloved child in terms of climate change. Most of the focus has been on mitigation. And when you look at Green Deal climate legislation, that's all legislation that's well entrenched. As I said, it existed for a long time now. These pieces of legislation, there are some that are new, but many of them have been revised several times. But they are not focusing on adaptation. That remains the prerogative of the local and the national level. I suppose on the one hand, there is kind of like there is a good case for it in the sense that the response has to be attuned to the local context to a large extent. So there is this idea that the European Union shouldn't do what is better done at the local level. Since Maastricht, that has the name of subsidiarity. Things should be done at the lowest level where it's the most efficient to do it. That justify that perhaps the primary response is at the local and the European level, but surely European coordination in response in crisis response can also have added value, and I think that there is definitely like more scope for that. That's been quite neglected, yeah. And perhaps linking to populism, I can see how it can also breed some frustration with the EU political system and how it responds to the concerns of people on the ground when it's not really there.
Okay, yeah, got it.
So you mentioned Macron and his taking a step back a bit. We moved too fast, he appears to have said, and we saw something similar in the United States. Biden and the support for green policies. The car manufacturers are saying, we need to continue to introduce hybrid, not just EVs. So the actions by Macron and Biden is this a response to a backlash, or is this the backlash? Are they themselves, they are gifted politicians? That's how they became, came to occupy these elevated political offices, and now they seem to not want to expend political capital on this. Yeah, what's your take?
Yeah, so in the specific case of Macron, I mean, he's the guy who coined the "Make Our Planet Great Again," right? So he's kind of like he rode the wave of climate change early in his first term. He launched the Climate Assembly in France and so on. But he has created a lot of frustration with environmentalists for a long time now. For instance, since the Climate Assembly, as basically a lot of people have criticized this for being like a nice toy that didn't lead to very much change, and it has been. And climate hasn't been central at all in the policies of the government for a long time. He created a climate planning directorate, but which is very much an empty shell. Everyone is wondering what it's actually doing. So in that sense, when he made this pronouncement about European politics, he had already shifted a while back. And I think part of the turn was not a response to this cycle of mobilization, although the French government also listens a lot to the farmers, but was also an earlier response to the Yellow Vest movement and so on. The Climate Assembly was a response to that, but there was also the sense, okay, we get people in the streets for weeks and months, and we have to be careful. And I think that has contributed already to shift the government to a large extent. And I mean, there also brought a shift. The Macron government was very much a centrist government that's then shifted more right. And as it shifted more right, it tried to appeal to people who care less about climate and don't want to do too much. So that's for the specific case of Macron. But I think you're right that when you look at plenty of leaders, you see kind of like you can see them. I mean, you have those who are already on the side of being very skeptical and who remain so, but you have many others who have become also much more cautious. And it's in part a response to the political cost of climate action, but also the way it has kind of been framed as such under the pressure also from other parties.
Do you think it is kind of unavoidable that the climate agenda has been occupied by the left? There should and could be also a direct interest of the right, of the populists, of conservatives. You know, there is a concept of eco-fascism, but that's too much. Just say a legitimate conservative interest in, you know, forests, reforestation, you know, keeping nature as it was, you know, claiming the kind of rights of the local people into nature, you know, landing this kind of green discourse, getting back to land.
Traditional values. Traditional values.
Traditional values, exactly. These are traditional values, and you know, and it's not entirely new idea. So Latour talked about that. But yeah, but of course, on this political level that you're talking about, this is what we see, that the green agenda is just fully linked, fully kind of taken by the left. The opposite is not true. I think that it is not that the left are fully preoccupied with the green agenda. But is there any kind of, do you see any kind of tendency, any sort of revival of this kind of right conservative traditional interest in the green, say, programs of reforestation as opposed to decarbonization, say, reforestation as an agenda?
Yeah, I mean, the conservation agenda from the 19th century is a pretty conservative type of agenda. I mean, the very name of conservation also gives the clue there. So it's true that there is a kind of an ecology of the right that has existed for a long time. But I think what I'm most struck by is that back in 2019, 2021, it felt like there was this kind of new Latourian cleavage around the environment, around climate, where it was not for or against, but it was what type of response, and the kind of the conservative type was like this localism, love for the country, and it was also linked with chauvinism and nationalism and the rest of it. But there was kind of like a positioning for another form of ecology. And it felt like there was a kind of like the ecology of the right versus the ecology of the left. But I think we have returned back to a much more left-right polarized issue here. where now you can, because I remember a lot of the kind of like populist or far right parties started talking about kind of like using this kind of nativist framings of like the protecting the local climate and the people and the country around them and so on. They were using a lot more this kind of discourse. You see Marine Le Pen in France and others flirting with this kind of discourse a little bit, but they didn't really take hold very much, and now they're all gone. It's all about like the green crap of the liberals. So I'm a bit like, I feel like in that sense, I don't know if it was a progress or not, but it feels like we are returning to kind of like more an ex ante situation. That's my sense, but I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I agree. But I think that the driving force is this kind of new radicalism of the right that have fully realized their dependence on oil, on this kind of money.
Yeah, like the retrenchment and fault lines are clear. Each side is taking more polarized position, like
Right.
the farthest
Mm.
position along the spectrum.
Right, but maybe a solution, or one of solutions, should be sort of merging or kind of fusing or whatever, dissolving these cleavages.
I think you need to come up with a totally different language and different communication strategies, because the climate, the Green New Deal, if you read it, it reads like an anti-capitalist manifesto. And you cannot, pull whatever the capitalists of this world. You cannot pull corporations. You cannot pull those on the right who stand up for, economic sovereignty and all that, and don't really care about inequalities into that terrain. I mean, this language, this culture is completely opposite. This is exactly what they are up against, and trying to co-opt them into that, it's just not going to work.
And it didn't help that it came from the coastal elites in New York,
No,
far
exactly.
from the heartland.
In that sense, I think your question about the name for the policy is a really good one, because it's not a smart communication strategy. Yeah. I have a question. So now with everything that's going on in the US and Donald Trump and this back and forth on the Paris and like all of this, I mean, it's complete chaos on the one hand, but a lot of it is completely predictable, and we know which way these policies and these, in which direction these things will develop. Do you think the EU has, given all the other fights that they have, all the other fronts or forts that they have to fold in this new delicate balance with the crazy child in the White House, is this going to be kind of put aside as something, less urgent and less necessary than saving the global security architecture?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the challenge right now for the EU is perhaps bigger than it has ever been. So it might be different, because if you look for guidance in the past, what you see is, for instance, when Bush withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol, the EU jumped in to kind of become the promoter of the Kyoto Protocol, pushing other countries to ratify it so that it could come into force, and claiming the mantle of the climate leader. And since then, the EU has really kind of like has seen it as part of its identity, that it is kind of a climate leader in international climate negotiation. It's not always, it's often at odds when it comes to giving money, but it has also worked quite closely with many developing countries that are asking for more ambitions. During the Paris Agreement, the EU was siding on the side of the ambitious coalition and so on. It has become part of the identity of the EU that it's ambitious on climate, and that's kind of like part of the climate leadership discourse, but that has also been entrenched in governance and institutional process and policies. So if you look at guidance from the past, what you see is you would expect resilience. When Trump withdrew the first time, the EU said, okay, we are not going to give up and so on, and we're going to still hold the fort, and it still adopted its more ambitious targets. So kind of when you look at guidance from the past, it doesn't look like it's going that way. But here, as your question indicates, here we are talking about a calling into question of a kind of like the global security architecture and multilateral framework that's kind of much bigger this time around. Yeah, so that could.
And Trump's less checked and less fettered this time around.
Yeah.
He's less deterred this time around.
And the support for him in Europe is much higher now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in the populist Europe, I mean, not in Europe at the EU level.
Maybe Trump is not so childish or not so crazy, or there is some system in his craziness. Because he's consistently anti-European, he's consistently pro-oil, consistently pro-Russian. It's like one particular concept, syndrome, whatever. It's like there is some cohesion in all this.
Yeah, his intuition seems stable. He's all over the place, but his intuitions seem stable, predictable.
And one of the outcomes is that he's consistently anti-green. That's a part of it. Is it like the co-part, is it the cause or a symptom of something else? That's something to discuss. But there is consistency.
But there is a security aspect, but there is also the challenge to multilateralism, that's why Trump doesn't like the EU, because it's a form of multilateral organization. But the point for the EU here is that it's at the core of its nature. It's what it is, right? So it's a kind of like a direct challenge to its very nature. So that's very difficult to navigate.
If I may, I think thinking aloud about the challenge that Trump is posing right now to the EU, I think my intuition is the Europeans are thinking we cannot. The best we can do during this term of Trump is not announce big, major, ambitious plans, because this would only provoke Trump, and everyone worries about his use of Twitter or Truth Social, whatever. That you become a target very easily, a target of Trump, and I don't think the Europeans want this. So for the time being, they say, okay, until Trump is out of the White House, let's not be too ambitious. But I think that the problem is Trump's now. You have a J.D. Vance, and you have the entire Senate, Republican Senate, which is they're as anti-climate, anti-progressive as Trump is. So the Europeans might be disappointed that at the end of Trumpism will not have died away.
But I think the first time around, there was definitely the feeling, okay, we can wait this out, and then there will be some Democrats who is gonna come back to the White House and will be back to the old habits again. It's more or less what has happened, but at this time it doesn't feel like that for the reasons you say. That this time we can't just wait it out. So we need to finally do something about developing a more autonomous defense. But I think there were some officials in NATO or the EU were saying it's a 10-year long project. It's not like for tomorrow. So because we are far too dependent.
The last question.
Okay, sorry. I think the other angle which European countries also need to be looking at is the fact that what is the probability that in the nearest future another party like Trump party will not come into some of these countries and with this type of opinion, like the way we have it in US now. And I'm just so a little bit curious that if that happens, then it will affect a lot of things and a lot of things thinking. But for me, it will not be a surprise because either far right or far left, the opinion varies, but there's a tendency that maybe in future party like that may also come up even in the European circle.
I mean, that's already the case effectively in a number of countries where you have the far right in coalition governments. So that's already the case to a large extent, and when it's not in coalition government, it's quite influential on existing coalition governments in a number of countries. So in some way that has already happened, and then there's also the examples of the PIS or Orban in Hungary and the inability of the EU to deal with this this form of internal dissent with governments that are ready to really fundamentally challenge certain things and play hard, but at the same time not leave the club, trying to kind of like get a real concession from the inside and undermining some of the principles which European cooperation relies on, or its identity relies on. Like when you look at, of course, at the case of the PIS or of Orban, the EU has been completely unable to deal with it. That's kind of like what Daniel Kelemen has called the autocracy trap within the European Union, because of the support they get within a number of institutions, because they protect each other at the level of the European Council and so on. So in some way, what you're saying is sort of like perhaps not happening in such a grand fashion as Trump, because the governance system of the EU is much more complex and fragmented, and it's not kind of this type of winner take all type system. So it doesn't happen in such a kind of like radical way, but in kind of we already get a glimpse of that, I think, and of this prospect.
Okay, thank you very much. Great discussion. Thank you all. So there is some refreshments, quote unquote.
Thank you to everyone online.